The alarm ripped through the station before I had even opened my eyes. Red light pulsed across the ceiling of my quarters, and a voice I did not recognize was shouting over the comm system that the outer hull had been struck. I rolled out of my bunk and hit the floor hard, my hands shaking as I pulled on my boots. My name is Vess. I am not from this planet, and in that first second of chaos, I forgot every careful lie I had built to hide that fact. The station was called Meridian, a maintenance and research post orbiting a frozen moon on the edge of human territory. I had been living among its crew for 4 months, pretending to be an exchange engineer from a remote colony, quietly studying the species that had sent me here. My real orders were simple: watch, record, do not interfere. Nothing about those orders had prepared me for the sound of metal screaming as something outside tore a gash into the station's side. I ran into the corridor and collided with Daniel, one of the maintenance techs, who grabbed my arm and hauled me upright without slowing down. "Debris storm," he said, his voice tight but steady. "A rock the size of a truck just clipped Module 4. We've got a breach." Behind him, sparks rained from a broken conduit, and the air smelled sharp and metallic. I could hear the station groaning, a deep sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the whole structure was in pain. My mind, trained for years to observe and record, tried to catalog the danger level, the probability of survival, the correct emergency procedure. None of it stopped my hands from trembling. "Where is everyone else?" I asked. "Sealing the breach. Come on, we need hands." We sprinted through a narrow passage lit only by emergency strips along the floor. Every few seconds the station shuddered, and I had to press a palm against the wall to keep from falling. I had seen simulations of hull breaches during my training. I had never felt one happen around me, the floor tilting slightly as pressure equalized, the terrifying silence that followed each shudder before the next one hit. We reached Module 4 to find it already crowded. Grace, the station's engineer, was shouting instructions while 2 others wrestled a patch panel toward a jagged hole in the wall. Beyond that hole, I could see stars, and for one terrible moment, I understood that the only thing between us and the vacuum of space was a thin curtain of emergency foam that would not hold for long. "Vess, grab that clamp," Grace called without looking at me. She did not ask if I was trained for this. She did not have time to ask. She simply expected that if I was standing there, I would help, and that expectation hit me harder than the alarm had. I grabbed the clamp. It was heavier than it looked, and my hands, unused to human tools, fumbled with the release mechanism, until Daniel reached over and flipped it for me without a word of complaint. Together we pressed the patch against the hole while Grace fired the sealant gun around its edges. The foam hissed and expanded, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, the terrible whistling sound of escaping air began to fade. "Pressure holding," Grace said, checking a small device on her wrist. "Barely." Nobody cheered. Nobody relaxed. We all knew this was only the first crisis of the night, because through the intercom, a woman named Priya, who ran communications, was shouting that a second debris cluster was inbound, larger than the first, and it would reach the station in under 6 minutes. I felt something cold settle into my chest, a fear sharper than anything I had cataloged in 4 months of study. I had watched these humans laugh at strange jokes, and cry over old photographs and argue about nothing at all. I had never watched them face death together, and the difference terrified me more than the debris storm itself. 6 minutes, Daniel repeated, wiping sweat from his forehead even though the corridor was cold. "That's not enough time to reroute power to the deflector array." "Then we make it enough time," Grace said. She was already moving, and the rest of us followed because there was nothing else to do. We ran again, this time toward the reactor core, a long tube of a room lined with humming machinery that I barely understood despite months of pretending to be an engineer. Grace threw open a panel and began pulling cables with quick, sure movements, calling out numbers to Daniel, who repeated them back and adjusted dials on the opposite wall. "Vess, hold this steady," Grace said, shoving a cable into my hands. It was warm, almost alive, and I could feel a faint vibration running through it that made my skin crawl. "Don't let go, no matter what happens." I held it. My arms burned within 30 seconds, but I did not let go, because somewhere in the back of my mind I understood that if I did, whatever Grace was building would fail, and the second debris cluster would finish what the first had started. The clock on the wall ticked down. 5 minutes. 4. Priya's voice crackled over the intercom again, reporting the cluster's speed, its size, the exact second it would strike if nothing changed. Her voice never wavered, even though I could hear, underneath the calm words, the same fear I felt in my own chest. 2 minutes, Grace said. "Daniel, cross the feed now." Daniel's hands moved fast, faster than I thought human fingers could move, and the machinery around us groaned to life. lights flickering along a control board that had been dark since I arrived on the station. A deep hum built beneath the floor, rising in pitch until it became almost a scream. "Deflector array is charging," Priya announced. 1 minute to impact. I do not know what made me speak in that moment. Perhaps it was the fear, or perhaps it was something else entirely. Something I had been carrying since my first week on Meridian, and had refused to name. "What can I do?" I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. Grace glanced at me, just for a second, and there was no time for kindness in her expression, only urgency. "Pray it works," she said. "That's all any of us can do now." 30 seconds. The hum reached a pitch that made my teeth ache. Daniel closed his eyes. Priya's voice counted down the final numbers, and I found myself gripping the warm cable so hard my knuckles ached, as if my grip alone could hold the station together. 10 seconds. 5. The lights flickered once, hard, and then the deflector array fired with a boom that I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. Through the small window at the end of the corridor, I saw a flash of light as the debris cluster shattered against an invisible field, breaking into harmless fragments that scattered away from the station like sparks from a fire. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then Daniel let out a breath that turned into something between a laugh and a sob, and Grace sat down hard on the floor, her hands shaking now that there was nothing left to hold steady. "We're clear," Priya said, her voice finally cracking with relief. "Repeat, we are clear." I let go of the cable, and only then did I realize how badly my own hands were shaking. I looked down at my palms, red from the heat of the cable, and felt something strange rise in my chest, a mixture of terror and relief so tangled together that I could not separate one from the other. I had studied human emotion for months from a careful clinical distance. In that moment, for the first time, I felt it instead of observing it. "You did good," Daniel said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "For someone who claims to be from a colony with no debris storms, you didn't freeze once." I did not correct him. I could not, in that moment, remember how to lie. We spent the next hour checking every section of the station for damage, moving from corridor to corridor with flashlights and tools, patching smaller cracks and sealing loose panels. The adrenaline slowly drained from my body, leaving behind an exhaustion so deep I could barely stand by the time Grace declared the station stable. It was only then, walking back toward the crew quarters, that I noticed something strange strung along the ceiling of the main corridor. Lights. Small, colorful lights wound around a railing that had somehow survived the chaos untouched. Beside them hung a string of paper shapes, stars and small figures cut from red and gold paper, swaying gently from the ventilation system's breeze. "What is this?" I asked, stopping to look up at them. Priya, walking beside me, followed my gaze and smiled, though her face was still pale with the last hours of fear. "We put those up yesterday," she said, "before the storm hit. It's almost Christmas." I had heard the word before, filed away in my notes as a recurring human ritual, involving decorations, gift exchanges, and gatherings around food. I had never considered what it might mean to see those same decorations survive a crisis that had nearly killed us all, still hanging there, absurdly cheerful against a backdrop of scorched metal and emergency lighting. "You almost died tonight," I said, unable to stop myself. "Does the celebration still matter?" Priya considered the question seriously, which surprised me. Most humans I had studied answered such questions quickly, without much thought. She walked a few more steps before answering. "Maybe it matters more now," she said. "We're still here to see it. That's kind of the whole point, isn't it?" I did not have an answer for that. I filed the question away instead, unresolved, and followed her toward the mess hall, where the rest of the crew had gathered despite the late hour, despite the exhaustion clearly written on every face. The room was small, barely large enough for the 11 of us, but somebody had strung more lights along the walls, and a battered metal tray in the center held small paper-wrapped packages that had clearly been hidden away for this exact night. Grace sat at the head of the table, still wearing her work gloves, and Daniel dropped into a chair with a groan, rubbing his shoulder where a falling panel had struck him during the repairs. "We still doing this?" he asked, gesturing weakly at the packages. "After the night we just had?" "Especially after the night we just had," Grace said, and there was something fierce in her voice that silenced any argument. One by one, the crew passed small gifts around the table, none of them expensive, most of them clearly made rather than bought. A carved wooden bird for Priya, a hand-drawn map of the station, labeled with private jokes, for a young technician named Leo who had joined the crew only weeks earlier and looked stunned that anyone had bothered. A pair of gloves, badly knitted, one finger noticeably longer than the others, pushed across the table toward me by Grace, who would not meet my eyes as she did it. You run cold in the low power sections, she said, as if that explained everything. I noticed a while back. I held the gloves in my hands, still trembling faintly from adrenaline that had not fully faded, and I felt the same confusion I had felt earlier, standing beneath the paper stars. These people had nearly died. They had spent their last free hours before disaster struck making small, useless, beautiful things for each other, objects with no purpose beyond kindness. And now, hours after facing death together, they were doing it again, as if the danger had only made the gesture more urgent rather than less. I don't understand, I admitted quietly, turning the gloves over in my hands. Why does this matter so much to you? Tonight of all nights? Daniel answered this time, leaning back in his chair with tired eyes. Because tonight of all nights is exactly when it matters, he said. Anybody can be kind when things are easy. Doing it right after nearly dying, that's when you find out if it's real. I thought about my months of careful notes, my clinical observations of human behavior, all of it suddenly feeling thin and incomplete. I had recorded countless instances of what I called emotional inefficiency, resources spent on gestures with no practical return. I had never once considered that the inefficiency might be the entire point, that spending something precious on another person, especially when survival itself was uncertain, might be the very thing that made humans dangerous and remarkable in equal measure. Put them on, Priya said, nodding at the gloves still resting in my hands. I pulled them on slowly. They did not fit well, one finger too long, the wool rough and uneven, clearly made by someone with more determination than skill. I did not take them off again for the rest of the night, even as the crew began to relax, sharing stories about past disasters, past holidays, past mistakes that had somehow become funny only in the retelling. Leo, still shaken from his first real emergency, asked quietly what would have happened if the deflector array had failed. Nobody answered directly. Instead, Grace reached over and squeezed his shoulder, and Priya started telling a story about an earlier disaster on a different station, years before Leo had joined the crew, when the outcome had been far worse. She told it carefully, honestly, without softening the loss at the center of it, and yet somehow the story ended in laughter, because the person she was remembering, she said, would have wanted it that way. I realized, listening to her, that this was not simple denial of danger. It was something closer to defiance. They knew exactly how close they had come to dying that night. They chose, deliberately, to spend the hours after in laughter and small gifts and paper stars, not because the danger did not matter, but because refusing to let it steal this moment from them was its own kind of courage. Later, when most of the crew had drifted off toward their quarters to finally rest, I remained in the mess hall with Grace, who was carefully coiling a string of lights that had come loose during the earlier chaos. I watched her hands, steady now, moving with the same careful precision she had shown while wrestling with cables during the emergency. You could have died tonight, I said. All of you. I watched it happen. I felt it happen. I know, Grace said, not looking up from her work. Yet none of you seem afraid now. She paused then, considering the string of lights in her hands before setting it down. We're afraid, she said. Every single one of us. We just don't let the fear decide what the rest of the night looks like. If we did, we'd have spent tonight hiding in our bunks instead of sitting together, and honestly, I think that would be a worse way to almost die. I sat with that thought for a long moment, the gloves still on my hands, still too large in one finger, still warmer than anything I had expected to feel that night. I thought about my orders, watch and record and do not interfere, and I thought about the report I would eventually have to file, describing everything I had witnessed in clinical, careful language. I did not know, in that moment, how I would explain any of it. I did not know how to describe the sound of Grace's voice ordering me to hold a cable steady, or the warmth of gloves made by hands that had, hours earlier, been steady enough to seal a hull breach and shaking enough afterward to nearly drop a cup of water. I did not know how to catalog courage that existed alongside fear rather than instead of it, or kindness offered most fiercely in the exact hours when kindness seemed least practical. Will you tell your people about this? Grace asked, and for a moment I wondered if she somehow already suspected the truth about who I was. I will tell them something, I said carefully. I am not certain they will understand it. Try anyway, she said. Some things are worth saying even if nobody understands them the first time. I nodded, and we sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the paper stars swaying gently above us, the lights along the wall casting a warm glow over the scorched panel Daniel had not yet had time to repair. Outside, beyond the thick reinforced windows, the stars remained exactly where they had always been, indifferent to the danger that had nearly claimed us, and indifferent too to the small, stubborn celebration happening inside this battered station. I thought about my 4 months of observation, my careful notes on emotional inefficiency, my clinical distance from everything I witnessed. I understood, finally, sitting there with borrowed gloves on my hands and the memory of fear still fresh in my chest, that I had been measuring the wrong thing entirely. The value of what these people did was never going to show up in any equation I had been trained to calculate. It lived instead in the choice they made, over and over, to hold on to warmth and courage in the exact moments when both would have been easiest to abandon. When I finally returned to my quarters that night, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical labor of the evening, I sat for a long time without writing anything at all. My notes remained blank on the screen in front of me, waiting for careful, clinical words that refused to come. Instead, I thought about Grace's steady hands during the crisis, and her uncertain ones afterward, about Daniel's tired laugh and Priya's story told with honesty and warmth in equal measure, about Leo's quiet fear and the gentle way the older crew members had answered it. I thought about gloves that did not fit and mattered anyway, about paper stars that had survived a disaster and continued to sway above people who had chosen, deliberately and without hesitation, to keep believing in something gentle even after staring into something terrifying. I understood, finally, why my superiors had sent me to study this species, and I understood, more importantly, why no report I could write would ever fully capture what I had learned. Some things, I realized, are not meant to be measured. They are meant to be felt, held onto, and passed on, one small imperfect gift at a time, especially on the nights when holding on to anything at all feels hardest.